Shortly after my daughter Emma was born, my then husband Brian and I bought a charming 120-year-old Victorian house in a small New England town. The move was meant to accommodate our growing family, which included the three of us and our spirited golden retriever, Max. As someone who'd grown up terrified of the dark, thanks to a deeply unsettling incident as a child involving a stranger peering into my bedroom window, I constantly reminded myself that the creaks, groans, and bumps in the night were just part of living in an old house. The towering oak trees outside scraped the windows on windy nights, the outdated radiant heating clanged and hissed, and the back gate never stayed latched, banging in the wind. Every time I heard an unexplained noise, I'd hide under the covers, trying to convince myself it was all perfectly normal. When Brian and I separated a few years later, I stayed in the creaky old house while he took Max. It was just Emma and me now, navigating life in the drafty Victorian. One evening, when Emma was about 4 years old, we were curled up on the couch in the living room, watching her favorite animated movie. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the room awash in the soft glow of twilight. My phone battery had died earlier, and being my typically scatterbrained self, I went hunting for the one charger I owned, which was usually somewhere inconvenient. I eventually found it on the kitchen counter. As I crossed the threshold into the kitchen, an unshakable sense of dread washed over me. Goosebumps prickled my arms, and my stomach dropped. Something felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. I turned toward the window above the sink and froze. The back gate, which I had secured earlier that afternoon, was wide open. Sitting cross-legged in the yard, barely illuminated by the fading light, was a figure. They wore a hood pulled low over their face and dark sunglasses despite the dimness. The figure was utterly motionless, staring directly at the house. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my breath catching in my throat. Even when I stepped closer to the window to ensure I wasn't imagining things, they didn't move. They didn't flinch. It was as if they were waiting. My heart pounded as I locked the back door and grabbed my charger and phone, retreating to the dining room. My hands trembled as I plugged in the phone and booted up my laptop, frantically messaging the first friend I saw online. I typed out a desperate plea. Someone was in my yard. My phone was dead, and I needed them to call the police if I didn't respond soon. I kept glancing toward the kitchen, expecting the figure to disappear once they realized they'd been spotted, but they stayed. Unmoving. Unnervingly still. Emma tugged at my sleeve, asking for water, but I couldn't bring myself to return to the kitchen. I stalled, waiting for my phone to charge enough to call 911. Finally, it powered on and I dialed, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. She assured me help was on the way and asked if I could check the yard without being seen. Steeling myself, I crept toward the kitchen, staying low to avoid being spotted through the window. I double-checked the back door, only to realize with mounting horror that while the door was locked, the dog door, large enough for a person to crawl through, was completely unsecured. My pulse quickened as I slowly stood to peek outside. Before I could get a clear view of the yard, a face appeared in the window, hooded, with dark sunglasses, staring directly at me. I stumbled backward, my voice rising in panic as I relayed the development to the dispatcher. She urged me to grab Emma and find a locked room. I dashed to the living room, scooped up my daughter, and explained in the calmest voice I could muster that we needed to play a hiding game. As I carried her upstairs, I heard the unmistakable sound of the dog door swinging open. My adrenaline surged as I bolted down the stairs and out the front door, Emma clinging to me tightly. We ran across the street to my neighbors, pounding on their door until they let us in. Their warm, bustling home was a stark contrast to the terror I'd just left behind. While they distracted Emma with a coloring book, I stood by the window, trembling and keeping an eye on my house. Police arrived within minutes, entering the yard cautiously. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged, leading the hooded figure in handcuffs. She, a woman, I later learned, had been sitting on my back step, lazily swinging her arm in and out of the dog door. She offered no explanation for her behavior, and the officers didn't press her for one in front of me. That night, I boarded up the dog door and bolted every lock in the house, but the damage was done. Every creak and groan of the old Victorian became a source of anxiety, every bump in the night a potential threat. Within a few months, I sold the house and moved Emma and me to a newer, quieter neighborhood. My cousin David was tragically shot and killed in the late 90s. He was only 21 years old, a victim of mistaken identity. David and I always got along well, and I loved him deeply, but we weren't especially close. So when I started dreaming of him constantly after his death, it was unsettling and emotionally draining. Years passed, I got married, had a daughter named Lily, and moved a few times. Yet the dreams persisted. They were vivid, almost too real, and left me feeling exhausted. One quiet afternoon, I dozed off on the couch in our living room while Lily, just a toddler, played quietly with her blocks on the floor. My husband Mark was at his evening classes and wouldn't be home until around 9 p.m. It was just Lily and me in the house. As I napped, I had another one of those lucid dreams. In it, I was exactly as I was, napping on the couch, but I became aware that David was approaching the house. The realization that he was dead filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't move, couldn't even call out. I watched helplessly as his shadow passed the front windows. I saw his silhouette through the frosted glass of our front door. My heart pounded in terror. In the dream, Lily noticed him too. She stood up from her blocks and toddled toward the door, babbling happily as if greeting an old friend. David tilted his head at the sound of her voice. I wanted to scream to stop her, but I was paralyzed. The fear was suffocating. Summoning every ounce of strength I had, I managed to move. I grabbed Lily and held her tightly, shielding her with my arms. Silently, I begged David, "I'm so sorry, David, but please, please, I can't. Please go. Please just go." His shoulders slumped and he turned away. I felt a pang of guilt, but the fear wouldn't let me call him back. Through the window beside the front door, I watched as he walked away, his figure fading as he rounded the corner by the garage. Then I startled awake. I sat up, heart racing, and scanned the room. Everything seemed normal. Lily was still on the floor, stacking her blocks, and the house was quiet. I shook off the dream, chalking it up to exhaustion and grief, and reached for a book I'd been reading. Immersing myself in the pages helped distract me from the lingering unease. At some point, I glanced up and noticed that Lily had stopped playing. She was staring at me, her expression unusually serious for a toddler. A strange tension filled the air, like the static before a storm. My ears began to ring, and I felt an inexplicable heaviness settle over the room. Then, without warning, a loud crashing sound shattered the silence. I jumped, clutching Lily instinctively. Looking toward the front door, I saw that the glass of our screen door had shattered, shards scattered across the porch. My pulse raced as I struggled to make sense of what had just happened. There was no sign of anyone outside, no logical explanation for the sudden break. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that David had tried to reach out one last time, and I had turned him away. Back in the late 2000s, when I was 23, I was living as a broke but happy expat in Prague. The city was magical. Its winding cobblestone streets, Gothic spires, and misty evenings made it feel like something out of a fairy tale. My roommate Sophie was a no-nonsense Brit with a sharp wit and a knack for spotting trouble. One chilly night in late November, Sophie and I were walking back from a small underground club in the Zhishkov district where we'd been watching a local band play. It was close to 1 a.m., and we were in high spirits, tipsy but not drunk, laughing loudly as we made our way to the nearest metro station. The streets were unusually quiet, the misty air swirling in soft yellow pools under the streetlights. The occasional breeze sent dry leaves skittering across the pavement. As we approached a long, dimly lit street leading to the station, we noticed a figure walking ahead of us. From the back, it appeared to be an elderly woman, hunched over, carrying 2 heavy bags. Her gait was strange. She seemed to be dragging one leg awkwardly behind her, each step accompanied by a slight scraping sound. We were speaking English, our voices echoing down the empty street, when the woman suddenly stopped and turned slightly. In a loud, exaggerated tone, she cried out in English, though her accent was distinctly Czech, "Oh, help! Won't somebody help me?" The voice stopped us in our tracks. It wasn't frightened or pleading, it was commanding, as though she expected to be helped. Sophie tensed beside me and whispered, "Let's keep moving." But I hesitated. The woman was elderly, alone, and clearly struggling. My inner good Samaritan kicked in. "What do you need help with?" I asked. She gestured dramatically to her leg and the bags. "It's my leg! Help me carry these bags!" "I live just there," she said, nodding toward an old apartment building a few steps away. Before I could think it through, I responded, "Of course, we'll help." Sophie shot me a look that could have burned through stone, but reluctantly followed as I grabbed one of the bags. As we walked closer to the building, the woman's features came into sharper focus under a streetlight. She looked exactly like a witch from a Central European folktale. Stooped posture, a large wart on her nose, stringy gray hair poking out from beneath a dark hood, and piercing eyes that seemed too bright for her wrinkled face. I nearly gasped, but told myself not to be rude. After all, she was just an old woman in need of help, right? When we reached the building, the door was ajar, a rare thing in Prague, where apartment buildings were usually locked up tight at night. She pushed it open easily, her frailty suddenly replaced with surprising strength. "Just up the stairs," she said, gesturing toward a narrow, dimly lit staircase that spiraled into darkness. I froze. The hallway smelled damp and smoky, like something that had been left to rot. A faint yellow light flickered above the stairs, and I could just make out a doorway at the top, slightly ajar. A wave of dread washed over me, but I hesitated. It would be rude to refuse to carry the bag up for her now, wouldn't it? "Go on, just up the stairs," she urged, her voice dripping with urgency. Something about her tone stopped me cold. It was almost theatrical, like a villain trying to lure their victim into a trap. I stood there, trying to rationalize the situation. Surely this wasn't as sinister as it felt, but my instincts and the prickling of every hair on my neck were screaming otherwise. Suddenly, Sophie grabbed my arm. "Oh, hell no," she said loudly, yanking me backward. She didn't wait for me to respond, pulling me out of the doorway and back onto the street. The woman shouted something unintelligible after us, her voice sharp with disappointment, but Sophie didn't stop until we were across the street and descending into the metro station. Once we were safely in the bright, bustling subway, Sophie let go of my arm and rounded on me. "What the hell were you thinking?" she demanded. I stammered. She was just an old woman. "Old woman, my ass," Sophie interrupted. "That limp wasn't there when she was walking ahead of us. And did you not see how she was trying to get you into that building? She was way too eager to get you up those stairs. I swear there was someone waiting for us up there. You could have been chained to a bed by morning." I laughed nervously, but her words sent a chill down my spine. The more I replayed the scene in my head, the more I realized how bizarre it had been. The limp that appeared out of nowhere, the open door, the strange urgency in her voice, it all felt like something out of a nightmare. To this day, I don't know what was waiting at the top of those stairs, and I'm grateful to Sophie's instincts for making sure I never found out. In the quiet outskirts of Ash Hollow, a rural community surrounded by dense woods and sprawling farmland, my husband Luke and I had settled into a peaceful life. Our neighborhood had its quirks, and one of them was the ever-present feral cat population. I've always had a soft spot for animals, so I kept food and water out on the deck for the scrappy little visitors. Last spring, during one of those chilly, restless nights, I woke up around 2 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. Our bathroom has a small window that overlooks the deck, and as I sat there in the half-dark, I glanced outside. The deck was faintly illuminated by the weak glow of our garage light, and I noticed movement near the food bowl. At first, I thought it was one of the usual visitors, a raccoon, maybe, or a large skunk. Then I squinted, and for a moment, I thought it might be a coyote, which wasn't unheard of in our area. But as my groggy brain started piecing together what I was seeing, I felt a cold chill creep over me. It wasn't an animal. It was a man. A grown man was crouched on all fours, hunched over the bowl, eating the cat food with his mouth. No hands, just his face in the bowl, like some kind of feral creature. I froze, barely breathing, and then whispered, "Luke! Luke! Wake up!" My voice must have carried an edge of panic because he came stumbling into the bathroom without a word. I could only point out the window, my hand shaking. He leaned over me to look, and I watched the same progression of emotions flash across his face: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a dawning horror. "What the hell?" he whispered, staring at the man who continued to eat, oblivious to being watched. "Call 911, Luke said, his voice low but firm. I grabbed my phone and shakily explained to the dispatcher that there was a strange man on our back deck eating cat food out of a bowl. "Ma'am," the dispatcher said after a long pause, "what do you mean, eating cat food?" "I mean exactly that," I whispered fiercely. "There's a guy on all fours with his face in the bowl eating the food like an animal. He's not using his hands." The dispatcher assured me a patrol car was on the way. Meanwhile, Luke crept downstairs to grab the baseball bat we kept in the front closet. I stayed by the window, peeking out through the curtains, unable to look away. The man didn't seem in any hurry. He finished whatever food was left in the bowl, but stayed crouched in that same animalistic position, his face hidden by the hood of his sweatshirt. He didn't move, just stayed hunched there, almost like he was waiting for something. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 or 6 minutes, I saw headlights coming down the road. As soon as the lights hit our driveway, the man moved. He rose slowly, almost casually, to his feet, brushed off his knees, and walked off the deck with an unsettling calm. He didn't run. He didn't even look back. He just disappeared into the shadows at the edge of our yard, swallowed by the darkness of the trees beyond. When the officers arrived, they swept the yard and surrounding area but found no trace of him. They parked a cruiser in our driveway for the rest of the night, but I barely slept. The next morning, Luke and I installed motion-activated lights and a security camera on the deck. We also decided to bring the cat food inside at night, at least for the rest of the month. It's been over a year now, and we haven't had another unwelcome visitor. But that night changed something for me. I used to love looking out the window at the stars or watching the cats slink across the deck in the moonlight. Now, every time I glance outside after dark, there's a part of me that's afraid I'll see him again, crouched on all fours, face buried in the bowl, more animal than man. And I don't know what's worse. The idea that he was just some disturbed drifter, or that he might still be out there, watching. Years ago, when our son Elias was just 3 years old, he went through a troubling phase of extreme night terrors that eventually escalated into sleepwalking. At the time, we were living in a modest, single-story home in the small, tightly knit town of Willow Creek. Elias wasn't particularly talkative yet, but he was an easygoing child. Despite the night terrors, he didn't seem afraid of his room or of sleeping alone. Each evening, he would happily toddle off to bed, leaving his tiny sneakers neatly placed beside his bed. We'd check on him later to find him curled up under his blanket, looking peaceful. But peace didn't last long. We discovered that letting Elias sleep in our bed with us seemed to prevent the night terrors altogether. For weeks, this became our nightly routine. It was a bit cramped, but it was a small price to pay for quiet nights. However, just as we thought we'd found a solution, the sleepwalking began. One night, I felt Elias climb over me in bed. Groggily, I assumed he was heading to the bathroom, and I drifted back to sleep. Moments later, his terrified screams shattered the silence. My husband, Daniel, and I bolted upright, disoriented and panicked. We found Elias standing next to his own bed, trembling uncontrollably. His eyes were wide and blank, pressing, I filled with a terror I couldn't understand. Daniel scooped him up, whispering reassurances as we carried him back to our bed. We held him close, but even after he fell asleep, we couldn't. That image of his small, shaking body stayed with us. This pattern repeated itself for weeks. Each time, Elias seemed more frightened, and each time, we felt more helpless. My mother, Rosa, was deeply concerned and eventually brought a woman named Dolores to our home. Dolores was a self-proclaimed curandera, a healer or spiritual practitioner. She claimed she could sense lingering negative energy in the house, left over from previous tenants. According to her, restless spirits of children had become attached to Elias. Horrified, we listened as she explained that these spirits were drawn to him because of his innocence. She performed a cleansing ritual, burning sage and murmuring prayers in Spanish as she moved through the house. She left us with a mixture of salt and herbs to sprinkle around Elias's room. The night terrors stopped after that, but it was as if the house itself came alive in response. We started hearing knocking sounds within the walls, like someone was tapping from the other side. Doors would creak open on their own, sometimes slamming shut as we approached them. One evening, a family photo flew off the wall with such force that it shattered the glass frame. On another occasion, we saw a shadowy figure, a man, walking past the kitchen window. When Daniel ran outside to investigate, there was no one there. The breaking point came when Daniel and I both had the same nightmare on the same night. In my dream, we were standing across the street, chatting with our neighbors, when they suddenly pointed to our house. "It's on fire!" they shouted. I turned to see thick black smoke pouring from the windows. Through the haze, I saw Elias banging his small fists against the front bay window, crying for help. Panicked, I ran across the street and into the house. The heat was suffocating, but I could hear his cries. Finally, I found him, or so I thought. I grabbed him and held him tightly to my chest as I ran back outside. When I got to the yard, I looked down and saw that I was holding nothing but his baby blanket. I woke up screaming. Daniel had a similar dream. In his version, he ran into the burning house and heard Elias calling out for him. He found him and picked him up, but as he carried him outside, he realized Elias felt impossibly light. When he looked down, he saw he was holding a teddy bear instead of our son. That was the final straw. The very next day, we packed up our belongings and moved into my parents' tiny guest room. It was cramped, but it felt safe. We put the house on the market immediately. Despite the strange energy in the home, it sold quickly. Against our realtor's advice, we told the buyer, a gruff, older man planning to turn the house into a rental property, about our experiences. He waved it off with a chuckle. "Superstition," he said. "People get spooked too easily." We never heard from him again, and we've never been back to Willow Creek. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that house. I wonder if the man who bought it ever noticed the knocks in the walls or saw the shadows in the windows. Most of all, I wonder if Elias was truly the one they were after, or if they're still waiting for someone new. It was more than a decade ago, during one of the hardest chapters of my life. I had recently moved to a small, sun-soaked desert town in southern Arizona to attend graduate school. My apartment was a tiny, bare-bones studio in a dilapidated complex near campus. It came furnished with mismatched, creaky furniture and walls so thin I could hear my neighbors cough. I was completely alone, with no real friends yet, and the relentless desert heat only amplified the oppressive weight I already felt. I was also battling acute PTSD, which I believed would eventually kill me. Years of suicidal ideation had left me raw, and this new chapter in my life felt less like a fresh start and more like an empty waiting room. To make ends meet, I scraped by with sporadic gig work, delivering groceries, proofreading essays, but my isolation and mental state made even the smallest tasks feel insurmountable. The day this happened, the sun was blazing in its late afternoon glory. My single window faced west, and the light streaming through it painted the room in hues of gold. The muffled sounds of campus life, footsteps on gravel paths, snippets of laughter, filtered through the cracks in the walls. I had lain down on my narrow twin bed, exhausted, trying to take a nap. I drifted in and out of a light sleep, curled on my side with my back to the wall and my head near the window. I wasn't dreaming yet, but I wasn't fully awake either. That's when it started. First, the room changed. The warm light dimmed, as though a heavy storm cloud had blotted out the sun, but there were no storms in the desert this time of year. The air turned cool and heavy, and the outside noises, the students, the footsteps, the faint hum of cars on the road, fell silent. It was as though the world had paused. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I felt it. Behind me, where the wall should have been, there was something else. I didn't dare turn around, but I could sense it, a presence, a shadow, something vast and dark that seemed to loom over me. My entire body tensed as I became aware of it, and that's when it moved closer. The shadow began to press into me. Not physically, there was no weight, but it was trying to enter me, to inhabit me. I can't describe the sensation fully, but it was like 1,000 needles of searing pain, as if every cell in my body was resisting its intrusion. It wasn't sexual, nor did it feel malevolent. It was more curious, almost clinical. My body screamed in agony, and I wanted to cry out, but no sound came. My lips formed a scream, but it was trapped inside me. The only thing I could think to do was fight back in the only way I could. I tightened every muscle, every fiber of my being, willing it out. To my shock, it worked. The pressure subsided, but only for a moment. The shadow tried again, more forcefully this time. The pain was unbearable, but I dug in, tightening every inch of myself even harder. It stopped again, hesitated. I could feel it trying to understand. There was no malice, only confusion, like it couldn't comprehend why I was resisting. I sensed its frustration, its puzzlement, and then a flicker of concern. It was as though it hadn't expected this to hurt me and was genuinely taken aback by my reaction. The shadow shifted, its form hovering above me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something pass, a dark, translucent mass, darker in some places and lighter in others, like a cloud of smoke that hadn't fully solidified. It seemed to study me, as if reevaluating its approach. It made one final attempt, extending what felt like a tendril toward me. By now, I knew what to do. I tightened every part of my body once more, and this time the shadow withdrew completely. The room returned to normal in an instant. The golden sunlight streamed in again, the sounds of campus life resumed, and the oppressive chill lifted. But I didn't move. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, unable to trust that it was really gone. Eventually, I sat up, my body aching from the strain of resisting. I didn't sleep for weeks after that, terrified it would come back. Even now, I can't nap without feeling a creeping sense of dread. I spent countless nights searching online for answers, but nothing fit. Sleep paralysis didn't explain it. I could move enough to fight back, and I wasn't dreaming. Hypnagogic hallucinations didn't account for the pain or the way I could feel the being's emotions, its curiosity, its confusion, and its strange, simple neutrality. The most unsettling part? It didn't feel human. Whatever it was, it seemed almost professional, like it had a job to do and had simply made a mistake by choosing me. Sometimes I wonder if I wasn't supposed to survive that year. Maybe one of my suicide attempts should have succeeded, and this being was there to collect what was left of me. Or maybe it was drawn to the raw, broken edges of my psyche, mistaking my vulnerability for an invitation. I don't know what it was or what it wanted. All I know is that I hope I never see it again. At least, not until it's truly my time to go. But strangely, I don't hate it. It terrified me, but it didn't seem malicious. If anything, it seemed almost regretful when it realized it had hurt me. Whatever it was, wherever it came from, I wish it well. I just hope it leaves me alone.